Hello, my name is Rayhan Maryam and I'm here with Maryam to tell you the story of the Jim Crow laws.
The Jim Crow era was an era of oppression, segregation, and discrimination. The Jim Crow laws began as early as 1865, which was soon after the abolishment of slavery in the United States. They affected thousands of African Americans over the course of 100 years, but this idea can be traced back even further, to a character in 1832, a one-man act, a routine known as Jump Jim Crow.
According to Cassandra Wagoner, a writer for the BlackPast.org, the character Jim Crow was originally played by a white actor named Thomas D. Rice, who would paint himself black and do a dance routine mocking African Americans while singing his song Jump Jim Crow.
Wheel about and turn about and do just so. Every time I wheel about I jump Jim Crow.
The song is rumored to be inspired by a disabled black man Rice saw in Ohio, allegedly named Jim Cuff or Jim Crow. Rice's act inspired a new trend of entertainment in the States largely based on the mockery of African Americans.
The term Jim Crow was eventually applied to racial segregation laws in the United States. This started as early as 1837, but the majority of the laws emerged in the southern states between the years of 1876 and 1895. The laws were meant to keep African Americans segregated from the whites. These laws banned interracial marriages, made buses, restaurants, and other public areas such as parks only available to whites, and even went as far as to punish anyone who promoted racial equality.
The parents were of mixed racial ancestry, making them Creoles, and making him, according to the racial pseudoscience of the day, 7/8 Caucasian and 1/8 African. As a result, when he sat in the whites-only car, he violated the state's segregation ordinance and was subject to arrest and fine. To put it plainly, he wasn't white enough. He had one too many drops of African blood.
A law in Alabama stated that no person or corporation shall require any white female nurse to nurse in wards or rooms in hospitals, either public or private, in which black men are placed. Law in Georgia stated that the officer in charge shall not bury or allow to be buried any colored person upon grounds set apart or used for the burial of white persons. A law in Mississippi stated that any person who shall be guilty of printing, publishing or circulating printed, typewritten or written matter urging of presenting for public acceptance or general information, arguments or suggestions in favor of social equality or of intermarriage between whites and blacks shall be guilty of a misdemeanor and subject to a fine of not exceeding $500 or imprisonment not exceeding 6 months or both.
But white Southerners took racial segregation to the extreme. Not only did they separate blacks and whites on streetcars and at schools, but also at hospitals, job sites, parks, stores, jails, restrooms, churches, and even cemeteries. If there was a way to separate people by race, white Southerners figured out how to do it.
The state that experienced the most resistance to Jim Crow was Alabama. There were many riots and protests, the most notable of which was the Montgomery bus boycott, led by Rosa Parks. This is the start to the civil rights movement initiated by blacks in the South. Another method of protesting Jim Crow laws were nonviolent sit-ins.
According to Britannica.com, the sit-ins started in North Carolina but spread to other states, resulting in the desegregation of many local businesses in those communities. They would take place at typically segregated lunch counters, and the African Americans would refuse to leave when denied service. Sit-ins were so effective because they caused economic hardship for business owners, who would typically have paying customers instead of protesting African Americans at their counters. The most notable sit-in is known as Woolworth's Lunch Counter, which was coordinated by the SNCC and lasted several days.
Of course, there were smaller acts of resistance done by everyday African Americans. Imogene Zwatkin Wilson was an African woman living in Tennessee during the Jim Crow era, and she tells us a story about how a group of African American businessmen launched a boycott of the city's largest newspaper in 1957 because the paper refused to refer to Africans as Mr. or Mrs. There are many other first-hand accounts of the Jim Crow era and many other stories of protests.
These protests were all part of a bigger civil rights movement. One of the most prominent moments in civil rights history was the March on Washington, which, according to History.com, started with the main purpose of gaining equal job opportunities for all. More than 200,000 people protested in Washington, D.C., and Martin Luther King gave his famous speech starting with "I have a dream." That phrase became a slogan for equality and freedom.
Martin Luther King advocated for nonviolent protests, but the marches sometimes got violent. According to History.com, the civil rights movement in Alabama took a turn for the worse on March 7, 1765, when the protesters were met by the Alabama State Police. When the protesters refused to back down, the police tear-gassed and violently beat the demonstrators. The entire march was televised and became known as Bloody Sunday.
The resistance and retaliation against the Jim Crow laws sparked the beginning of many acts that were for equal rights for African Americans. The Fair Housing Act and the Voting Rights Act were both during the Civil Rights Movement.
The Fair Housing Act was created in 1968. It was the third major civil rights act that was passed in the 1960s alone. It was passed a week after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. It was an attempt to prevent discrimination about race, color, national origin, religion, gender, familial status, and disability when it came to buying or renting houses. Since the Fair House Act, many people have gone to court suing homeowners, who are usually white, for not selling or renting to them because of their race, and most of them made a lot of money off these accusations. In 2017, more than 28,000 complaints of housing discrimination were filed across the country. People filed lawsuits against cities, banks, and landlords.
Although the 15th Amendment removed racial barriers from voting in 1870, each state put into place ways to stop African Americans from voting. This included taxes to pay, which they knew the black community couldn't afford. It wasn't until 1965 when the Federal Voting Act was passed, giving African Americans the right to vote. 8 days before the current president at the time, Lyndon B. Johnson, signed the Voting Rights Act. Martin Luther King Jr. had led a peaceful march in Alabama. People had hoped they wouldn't have to keep reinforcing this act because they thought problems about racial discriminatory voting would calm down, but they were wrong. Congress had to extend enforcement-related provisions in 1970, 1975, 1982, and most recently in 2007, this time for 25 years.
Although all of these acts were passed and marches took place, racial discrimination is still present in today's society, and there are still anti-racism protests happening everywhere.